Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution area of study 1. In this video I'm going to look at how the Dumas contributed to the February 1917 revolution. So let's get into it. Before we look at how they contributed to the 1917 revolution, we should go back a little bit and just have a look at why they were actually created in the first place. So they were created as a consequence of the 1905 revolution and the promises that the Tsar made in the October Manifesto of 1905. And the October Manifesto was written by the Tsar in order to appease the demands of many of the revolutionaries, in particular liberals and some of the peasant groups and so forth, who were calling for, amongst many other things, the creation of a legislative parliament or a legislative Duma, a Duma with lawmaking powers. In the October Manifesto, the Tsar promised to create a legislative Duma. He also promised some other things as well: the introduction of freedom of speech, assembly and worship, as well as the legalising of trade unions. So these were some very important promises. And these promises were very significant in easing the tension within Russia at this time and eventually stopping the revolution, appeasing the revolutionaries, because they achieved, or they thought they had achieved, what they had set out for, which was, as I said before, in particular, a legislative Duma. However, when the Tsar realised that he had regained control over the situation, he actually reneged somewhat on these promises that he made. When the first Duma opened in April 1906, and you can see a photo there of the opening of the Duma, he restated his fundamental laws. And these fundamental laws were a set of laws which set down his powers as Tsar and his position within the political system in Russia. And in particular, Clause 9 of the fundamental laws, and he restated these and he said these are still in place. The sovereign emperor ratifies laws, and without his ratification approval, no laws can go into effect. So this Clause 9 effectively broke the promise that was made in the October Manifesto for the creation of a legislative Duma, because even though a Duma was created, and you can see the Duma opening there in that photo, this Duma did not have lawmaking powers because the Tsar himself held the sole right to ratify all laws. The Duma deputies could certainly discuss new laws and so forth, but they would not come into being without the Tsar's final approval. The Tsar also limited the Duma's powers by the way the Duma was structured. So the Duma itself had two houses, a lower house and an upper house. The lower house, the majority or the deputies within the lower house were elected by the people of Russia, but the majority of members in the upper house were not elected, but rather appointed by the Tsar himself, and they were Tsarist loyalists. So the upper house itself also had the power to block any possible laws coming from the lower house. Okay, so that's how the Dumas were limited in their powers. Let's now have a look at who dominated the Dumas. And the Dumas consisted of deputies from lots of different parties. There were 4 Dumas, and we'll have a look at each of these Dumas in turn. There were 4 Dumas because the Tsar dissolved each of them. Even the 4th he tried to dissolve, but it was unsuccessful in dissolving it. He dissolved them because they were critical of the way he was ruling Russia, which we'll have a look at in more detail later in this video. So the first Duma, it was dominated by SRs, who ran as labourists, and cadets, and it ran from April to June 1906. And you can see I've included the numbers of deputies or labourist deputies. There was 136, and there were 182 cadet deputies. And the leader of the cadets at this time, the majority party in the first Duma, was Milyukov, that very famous revolutionary, liberal revolutionary from 1905, the 1905 revolution. So this first Duma was very critical of the Tsar, and the Tsar had enough of the deputies' criticisms, and he decided to dissolve this Duma in June 1906. We'll see later in this video when the Tsar dissolved this Duma, many of the deputies from the Duma actually went to Finland and they wrote up the Viborg appeal, and we'll have a look at why that was significant later in the video. After the first Duma, there was the second Duma, and this was dominated by Labourists and national parties and cadets. So the cadets, as a consequence of the Viborg appeal, which I just referred to, they actually lost a lot of support within Russia. They still had 91 deputies in the second Duma, but it was the majority of deputies came from were Labourists as well as the national parties. The second Duma ran from February to June 1907. I'm giving you these. I'm giving you the numbers of deputies as well as the period when these Dumas did run, because you may have to refer to them in the exam. The third Duma was dominated by Liberals and right-wing parties, and it ran from November 1907 to June 1912. So the Octoberists were the largest party with 154 deputies, and then second were the Rightists, so pretty much Tsarist loyalists, and there were 147 deputies. And if you have a look at the makeup of the deputies, or the numbers of deputies, and which parties they belong to, you'll see there's quite a significant change between the second Duma and the third Duma. In particular, there were no Labourists and there were no cadets, and this was a consequence of Stolypin changing the voting rules for the third Duma, and he stopped many poorer people from voting, and only property people with wealth and property were allowed to vote for the third Duma, and they voted in those deputies who supported their wealth, particularly Rightists and so forth. Okay, so this Duma ran from November 1907 up to June 1912, ran for quite a long time, as you can see, but even this Duma was critical of the Tsar, and the Tsar had enough of it, so he dissolved the third Duma and then had elections for a fourth Duma, and this fourth Duma was dominated by right-wing parties. It ran from November 1912 up to August 1914. August 1914, it voluntarily dissolved itself as a patriotic act to support the Tsar during or at the outbreak of World War I. You can see there, though, that it then reformed in June 1915 and went through right till February 1917 in response to the poor handling of the war by the Tsar and the mounting defeats that the Russian military was suffering at the hands, particularly of the Germans. So the fourth Duma, there were 95 Octoberists and there were 154 Rightists. And you can see, so it's dominated by Rightists, Tsarist loyalists. However, even these loyalists were very critical of the Tsar and the poor handling of the war effort. I've got over there, you can see a political cartoon from Punch magazine, and it was released on the 8th of November 1905, and it's called The Release. And you can see in the background the Tsar has opened up a cell and he's released Lady Liberty. So this political cartoon was created in response to the signing or the passing of the October Manifesto and the promise of the creation of a legislative Duma. All right, let us keep going. So the achievements of the Dumas. So they weren't just critical of the Tsar, they actually achieved some good things for the Russian people as well. In particular, the third Duma established schools for the poor as well as national insurance for workers. Yet, despite this, they were a major contributing factor to the Russian Revolution of February 1917. And how did they contribute? Well, we'll go back firstly in time a little bit to June 1906, and I referred to this before, to the Viborg appeal. So this is when the Dumas, 200 cadets and Labourists went to Finland after the first Duma was dissolved. And they went to Finland and they wrote up this Viborg appeal, urging the Russian people to undertake passive resistance against Tsarist rule in the form of not paying taxes, and refusing conscription orders. The Russian people, however, didn't passively resist, but in many places violently resisted. And as a result, Stolypin had to introduce martial law, or didn't have to, but he did. And as a consequence of martial law, between 1906 and 1911, there were over 2,500 executions, hangings, and you can see the little phrase there that was used for these executions or these hangings, Stolypin's necktie. And these executions contributed to an increase in social tension. And you can see there we've got another cartoon, and once again by Punch magazine, and this cartoon, political cartoon, was created in response to when the First Duma was dissolved in 1906. You can see on the rock in the middle of the political cartoon is Mother Russia, or Lady Liberty, probably Mother Russia I reckon, and she's staring down aghast at a dead baby who represents the Duma, young democracy dead. In the background you can see carrion birds waiting to feast. Okay, and another way that the Dumas contributed to a revolutionary situation by February 1917 in Russia was their constant criticism of the Tsar. So, as I've mentioned before, the first, second, third, fourth Dumas, the deputies were critical of the way the Tsar was running the country, and then eventually, once the war started, the way he was conducting the war. Their criticisms, the various speeches that they made in the Dumas, were published in newspapers in Russia. People heard about them in Russia, peasants and workers, and then they became angry at the Tsar as well. So this criticism of the Tsar within the Dumas increased social tension. And I've just got a couple of quotes here that are evidence of this. So the first quote is from a Moscow Okhrana report of 1913, and it writes, "People can be heard speaking of the government in the sharpest and most unbridled tones, influenced by questions in the Duma and the speeches which they called forth there. Public tension is increasing still more. It is a long time since even the extreme left has spoken in such a way, since there have been references in the Duma the necessity of calling a constituent assembly and overthrowing the present system by the united strength of the proletariat." So you can see in this Okhrana report a direct link between the criticisms that the deputies are making within the Duma and how this is contributing to people getting angry on the streets. Okay, let's now look at one of these speeches in the Dumas, and this one was made by Paul Milyukov in the Fourth Duma on the 1st of November 1916, and he said, "When the Duma declares again and again that the home front must be organised for a successful war, and the government continues to insist that to organise means to organise the revolution, and consciously chooses chaos and disorganisation, is this stupidity or treason? We have many different reasons for being discontented, but all these reasons boil down to one general one, the incompetence and evil intentions of the present government, the present Tsarist government." And I am sure he is alluding there to not only the poor rule or decision making of the Tsar himself, but the influence of the Tsarina and in particular Rasputin. Okay, so the Fourth Duma, once we get to the Fourth Duma, they were critical of the Tsar, but they also were concerned about the welfare of Russia itself, and they all wanted success for Russia in the war against Germany. And one thing that the deputies did in the Fourth Duma was that they formed a Progressive Bloc, and this was formed on June the 25th, 1915, and it was an alliance of most of the deputies from all right across the political spectrum. What they were trying to do was that they were trying to improve the way Russia was governed. They were trying to be more supportive of the Tsar. So what they did was they offered to support the Tsar by mobilising the factories, the press and networks of organisations such as the Zemgor if the Tsar agreed to the creation of a national government permitting it, that is the Duma, to nominate ministers it trusted. And the Tsar rejected this offer. And he rejected this offer because this would be a way of limiting his authority, because these ministers would be more loyal to the Duma deputies than to the Tsar himself. Vasily Shulgin, the leader of the Progressive Nationalists and an ultra-loyal supporter of the Tsardom, complained the whole purpose of the Progressive Bloc was to prevent revolution so as to enable the government to finish the war. In the end, even the Tsar's most loyal deputies had had enough. The Tsar tried to disperse the Fourth Duma, and a group of deputies formed themselves into a Provisional Committee, and they refused to disperse themselves, and then this Provisional Committee actually formed the Provisional Government on the 27th of February 1917. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now about how the Dumas contributed to the February 1917 revolution. And the first one is by Richard Pipes, and he writes, in the evening, Rodzienko visited Prime Minister Golitsyn to inquire whether the Tsar would consent to the formation of a Duma ministry. Golitsyn told him of Nicholas's negative answer. When Rodzienko returned with this information to Torada at 10 p.m, there followed lengthy discussion in the Provisional Committee, which led to the conclusion that there was no choice but to assume de facto governmental authority. The alternative was either the complete collapse of order or the assumption of power by a rival and radical body, the Petrograd Soviet, which had come into existence the very same day, 1st of March 1917. And here is another historical interpretation, this one from the HCPSU. And it writes, the socialist, revolutionary and Menshevik leaders of the Petrograd Soviet therefore did their utmost to shelve the question of terminating the war, to shelve the question of peace, and to hand over the power to the bourgeoisie. On February 27th, 1917, the Liberal members of the Fourth State Duma, as the result of a backstairs agreement with the socialist, revolutionary and Menshevik leaders, set up a Provisional Committee of the State Duma, headed by Rodzienko, the president of the Duma, a landlord and a monarchist. And a few days later, the Provisional Committee of the State Duma and the Socialist, Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders of the Executive Committee of the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, acting secretly from the Bolsheviks, came to an agreement to form a new government of Russia, a bourgeois provisional government. So there are a couple of historical interpretations about how the Dumas contributed to the February 1917 revolution. I hope you have found this video useful for your study of the Russian Revolution, Area of Study 1, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.